This season of This Headache Journey is sponsored by gammaCore, non-invasive vagus nerve stimulator, the drug-free solution for migraine and cluster headache. gammaCore is the first and only FDA-cleared non-invasive device to treat and prevent multiple types of headache pain via the vagus nerve. It's small, handheld, and portable for quick and easy treatments whenever and wherever needed. gammaCore is safe, effective, and easy to use. Learn more at gammaCore.com. That's GAMMA core.com. Hi, I'm Adam Flaherty. Welcome to This Headache Journey. I've created this podcast as a resource for you, fellow headache or migraine sufferer, and it's the exact resource that I wish I had when I first started exploring my own chronic daily headaches over 15 years ago. I want to remind you that I am not a doctor, and nothing you hear in this podcast constitutes medical advice in any way. I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but even having seen many different providers and headache specialists over the years, it can be tough to get a proper diagnosis. The closest I've gotten is being told that my headaches are likely tension type, but some symptoms track more closely with other types of headaches or migraines. And what I've come to learn is that there are many different things that contribute to my headaches and trigger my headaches, so as a result, there are many different things that I need to address in order to reduce them. But because I've tried so many different interventions, my doctors are fairly supportive when I want to try something new that I've discovered. For the past year or more, I've been hearing and reading a lot about vagus nerve stimulation, mostly through ads on social media. I guess the algorithms figured out that I have headaches. But nonetheless, I was intrigued by it, and so I did some research and found some clinics who offer vagus nerve stimulation, but nothing local to me. I also found several devices that you can purchase online, and my curiosity continued to grow. I reached out to one of those companies, electroCore, about a product that they offered called gammaCore. The copy on their website claims that gammaCore treats and prevents migraine and cluster headaches without pills, injections, or drug-like side effects, and all of that is enticing to me. But what I wanted to know is, for someone with what can best be described as chronic tension-type headaches, could this product still be effective? Full disclosure, if you didn't already put the pieces together from the pre-roll ad before this episode started, my communications with gammaCore also led them to becoming a sponsor of this season of the podcast. More on that in a minute. But I ended up connecting with Dr. Peter Staats, who invented the product, and he confirmed that the product was very safe for me to try, even without cluster headaches or migraine. And so, hoping that it might be the magical thing, I gave it a try. Now back to the sponsorship part. I made it clear to the gammaCore team that I was really interested in trying the product, but if I were to create an episode about it, it was really important to me that I was sharing my honest experience, whether it was effective or not, and they were good with this. Now, normally I spend some time before the interview portion of the episode describing the experience of the intervention in detail so that you know exactly what to expect if it's something that you choose to look into. But in this case, I go into detail on all of that during my conversation with Dr. Staats. So, with that, here is our chat about gammaCore non-invasive vagus nerve stimulator.
I'm Peter Staats. I am co-founder and chief medical officer of electroCore. It is a leader in bioelectric medicine generally, and we've also been very involved in vagus nerve stimulation.
So I'd love to ask you about vagus nerve stimulation. Can you give our listeners and myself basically a brief explanation of what vagus nerve stimulation is and why it can be helpful for folks with chronic headaches and migraine?
Sure. So the vagus nerve is one of the most important nerves in your body that you may have never heard of. It is the main conduit of the brain to the rest of the body and tells the body about what to do, and the body tells the brain what's the status of that organism out there. We've recently learned how to tap into the vagus nerve to treat a variety of different disorders. I got started with this 20 years ago when my son had peanut allergies and I was looking to solve airway reactivity and anaphylaxis. Over time, we started to look at inflammation generally, and we've done studies on COVID and other areas of inflammation. But a really important area, and one of the early areas for the company, was looking at vagus nerve stimulation for headaches. Interestingly, when we were studying airway reactivity, some of the patients, when queried, said, "My headache went away." And so it turns out that the vagus nerve controls electrical excitability in the brain, seen in headaches. It controls the production of certain neurotransmitters that are excitatory, like glutamate. It can control inflammation in the brain. And so all of these areas pointed towards a treatment for headaches. And we've done all the animal work originally, and then we did double-blinded, randomized, sham-controlled trials showing that the therapy works for both cluster headache and migraine headaches, for acute and prevention, and have FDA clearances for those different indications as well as a few others.
So, why specifically cluster headaches and migraine versus the other classifications of headaches?
Well, to be fair, the FDA wants us to do specific studies for specific indications. We started with cluster headache partly because it was such an unmet medical need. It was something that we call suicide headache. If you know anybody who've had a cluster headache, they frankly want to kill themselves because the pain is so bad and the therapies that we've offered to people have been relatively poor. Keeping people isolated and a prisoner in their own homes effectively because they can't function, they can't drive, they can't go out when they're in these bouts. We did studies that showed that we could block them from coming, block cluster headaches from occurring at the same rate that they previously had, and could abort a cluster attack. We then went into migraines because physiologically it made sense, and about 14% of the population has migraines at some point in their lives, and people want a non-opioid, non-drug therapy that actually really works. So this was the starting point for us. But the science makes sense that we could go into other areas. We just haven't completed the FDA studies for all of the types of headaches. We have done paroxysmal hemicrania and hemicrania continuum. So we have those additional indications. But in terms of FDA approvals, we've not gone after yet trigeminal neuralgia and other indications like that.
Are there other ways that the vagus nerve can be stimulated? Because I feel like some of the videos or ads that I've seen seem to imply, and I don't know because I haven't dug in that deep on them, but they show people laying on their side with a device that sort of seems to be manipulating their atlas bone or their neck. Are there different ways that it can be stimulated, and how does your technology differ from something like that?
So there are basically 4 different strategies for stimulating the vagus nerve, and I'll kind of summarize it. First, it's, I'll say, non-invasive. And these therapies have been around for several thousand years. Tibetan monks use meditation and other strategies that calm the nervous system. Cold water immersion, and some of your viewers may have heard of the cold plunge, and that's stimulating the vagus nerve. There are sound protocols that have been developed that activate the vagus nerve specifically. Pranamaya yoga are other strategies that are generally used with deep breathing that activate the vagus nerve naturally. The second general strategy has been a surgical implant. In 1997, the first FDA approval for a surgical implant was done for vagus nerve stimulation, and that was for the treatment of epilepsy. Remember, I said excitatory or overexcited brain, that's what you see in epilepsy. And they got an approval originally back in 1997 and a second approval in 2005 for treatment of major depressive disorder that is resistant to drug therapy. A third strategy is non-invasive vagus nerve stimulation, is what we do. And we have basically all of the patents around stimulating the vagus nerve non-invasively in the neck. Some people are trying to skirt this with, saying they're going onto nerves that don't exist, and et cetera. See, buyer beware of some of these other advertisements. But cervical non-invasive is probably, in my mind, the best strategy for stimulating the vagus nerve. One has access to getting all of the fibers in the neck, both afferent and efferent, controlling the organism's physiological functions and getting most of the information up into the brain. But another good strategy is an auricular stimulator, which has been around for a while, and there's a very small number of fibers that come into a little portion of the ear, maybe 1,000 fibers that come into the ear that send only signals to the brain. And people have figured out a way of creating a device that goes on the ear that can stimulate continuously for an extended period of time. But by comparison, 1,000 fibers in the ear versus about 150,000 fibers in the neck. So, less than 1% of the fibers that you're going to be trying to achieve can be achieved in the ear. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. That doesn't mean that they're not a valuable tool. But I just think if you compare the two from a physiology standpoint, even an outcome standpoint, the only device approved for migraines and cluster headaches from a vagus nerve perspective is, in fact, the cervical vagus.
Okay, so I'd love to hear a little bit about the background of your company, electroCore, and how electroCore and gammaCore as a product line are related.
So we have gammaCore and the gammaCore family of therapies, which is FDA approved for migraine and cluster headache and acute and prevention, paroxysmal hemicrania, hemicrania continuum. And there's different brands of the gammaCore device. There is, in fact, a wellness device called Truvaga that people can access for sleep, mood changes, general wellness therapy that doesn't go through the FDA. And then there's TechStim, which is what the military uses to enhance performance of their elite soldiers who are trying to learn a new language, have fatigue problems, want to decrease error rates in activities. So there's really 3 separate brands within electroCore that are harnessing the vagus. And then we also have the Neurometrics brand, which is the Quell brand. And right now, this is the only FDA-approved device for fibromyalgia. And that's out there. It's a recent acquisition, so it's a little bit harder for people to get at this point.
Okay, so speaking specifically about the gammaCore brand under your company of electroCore, the product that I've been using is, just for listeners, it's around the size of maybe a deck of cards, and I hold it up to the front of my neck, and I alternate which side I'm using depending on the day or the time of day that I'm using it. I just alternate. But I wonder if you can give a bit of insight into what's actually happening when I'm holding it up to my neck. So on the end of the product that touches my skin, there's these 2 little metal nubs. But give me a sense of the technology, what's actually happening when you hold it up to your skin.
So part of the secret sauce here is that we've developed a specific frequency that is embedded in a sine wave. So it's not a square wave that hurts the skin, but it's a sine wave. So it's a gentle signal through the skin. And so it doesn't, as you know, it doesn't hurt. It can be a little bit of discomfort when you get started with it, but it's not painful per se. We turn it on for approximately 2 minutes, and then the device will turn itself off. So this, the secret sauce is it is a 5,000 hertz sine wave that's bursted every 25 hertz. And all of those little pieces actually matter because that allows us to go through the skin, changes the impedance of the skin so it gets in deeply to the vagus nerve, what prior to our technology people thought was impossible. It activates the vagus nerve and specific fibers within the vagus nerve that control headache and other physiological functions without slowing the heart rate or stopping your breathing. It actually does, it's selective in the fibers that we're getting. And then we only have to do it for about 2 minutes, and sometimes we have to repeat it twice, up to twice for the headache indication. I should say we're looking at a variety of other areas like the acute treatment of stroke, trying to decrease the size of an infarct when a stroke is occurring. And I suspect we're going to need more than 2 minutes to do that. And we're looking at Parkinson's. And I suspect we're going to need a little bit more than that because we're doing other things with Parkinson's as well. So we're still working through some of the details based on the different disease states that we're treating. Headaches, we've pretty much got it figured out. It's 2 minutes of stimulation, 2 to 3 times for prevention, and similarly for acute treatment as well.
And I think that's an important thing for listeners to know is that the product can be used, like you just described, Dr. Staats, for prevention, but it can also be used for treatment when they're experiencing a headache or migraine. And I think that's really revolutionary. So the first time that I used the product, I thought, this kind of feels like a TENS machine, a TENS unit. And some listeners may have familiarity with the TENS. It's almost a similar sensation, but I imagine that the technology is actually very different. Can you describe how this is different from a TENS unit?
Well, a TENS unit is transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulation, and it's not intended to go to activate a specific deep nerve. That a TENS unit is specifically not that. gammaCore does go through the skin, so it's transcutaneous. It does go through the skin, but it's intended to activate the vagus nerve. Second point is that a TENS unit's actually got a little black box warning on it because it can potentially activate the wrong fibers and stop your heart. That's why it says don't use on the neck, because they don't want you to stimulate the vagus nerve. Our frequency that we developed was specifically designed to not stop your heart and to really activate specific pain fibers and other fibers in the neck without affecting what's called the cardiac accelerators, the ability to change your heart rate, et cetera. So it's really a matter of design of what you see between what is a TENS unit. It's not a gammaCore. They activate different different nerves. And a TENS unit uses a square wave typically, which is painful. This is not painful.
So currently, somebody who's experiencing cluster headaches or migraine would have to obtain a prescription in order to purchase the gammaCore device. Is this as easy as someone just going to their PCP or neurologist and requesting a prescription? How do they start that process?
Well, first of all, if you are a veteran, it is fully covered by the Veterans Administration. They understand the value of this. If you happen to live in London or the UK, they've actually done the work that shows that in their system, not only does it work to help with the cluster headaches, but it actually saves money for the UK system. They've done the big analysis that says, in our system, instead of going to the ER, instead of getting certain drugs, instead of getting high flow oxygen, instead of getting more MRIs, people just go on this and they're happy and they stop using the healthcare system as much as they otherwise would. And so they've found that it saves them money, and it's called cost dominant. Kaiser now covers the device, which is one of the big healthcare systems out there. And then the patient can go to their physician at Kaiser and say, hey, you're on formulary for cluster headache. If that's what I have, can you prescribe this for me? And it's great because it's a non-drug therapy. In today's world, we're still worried about the opioid epidemic, et cetera. And I'm not a never opioid guy. That there are people in that camp. I just think we need to be very judicious and cautious about who we're prescribing opioids for, particularly in the headache space. And this is a therapy that checks those boxes. So Kaiser's now put it on formulary, and it's got a way through. Some of the other insurers transparently are just not as progressive, and they've not done the homework to say, we want to do something that's other than opioids for our patients with migraines. And so we're still working on that. And I still hope to get some of the other insurers on board. But right now, that's still a challenge for them.
I would love to hear you share just a general idea of the feedback that you've received. Have you found that there's been a high success rate for people in reducing the frequency and intensity of their headaches?
Yeah, look, in some of the studies in the real world, 70% of people are able to abort their cluster headaches or have them not even come on anymore. So it's very gratifying to have been part of a therapy that is extraordinarily safe and extraordinarily effective and is avoiding the opioid epidemic and avoiding some of the more invasive procedures that I do for patients with cluster headache. And part of my other life is I've been president of the World Institute of Pain and the North American Neuromodulation Society. And I just got back from a trip to Istanbul and London, and to talk with my colleagues in the UK and Belgium, where it's now a covered therapy as well. In the Belgian system, they have reimbursement. And in Istanbul, to talk with the colleagues who come together around the world who are now actually saying, hey, I've got a therapy out there for my patients. It's been a very gratifying career. They say we're a very long-term overnight success. It's taken a while to get here, but we're getting there.
Well, and from what you're describing, it seems like this is really just the beginning too. Now that you've got the product in the market and you're developing so many more different use cases. You mentioned that it's extraordinarily safe. Are there any risks that listeners should be aware of, or anything that maybe the better question is, are there any concerns that people come to you with and say, before I use this, can you assure me that X, Y, or Z won't happen?
Yeah, no, so the one that I still worry about is someone who's got a defibrillator pacemaker. And a defibrillator pacemakers mean, look, you've had heart problems in the past. Your heart tends to just stop on its own, and your doctor's made a decision to implant a series of electrodes on your heart that if they recognize your heart has stopped, they'll start shooting, they'll start it up again. Or if the heart is in a funny rhythm, meaning it's just not beating correctly, the heart gets shocked. What worries me is that the heart and the defibrillator pacemaker could read this as something, abnormal and shock a patient. And that's what keeps me up at night. We've done studies in patients with pacemakers, and they're not reading it. It's too far away. Nonetheless, it makes sense that could be a problem, and so that's what worries me. As far as I know, I think I would have been told had it ever happened, but that is the biggest one that worries me in all of this.
And in just bouncing back to the success stories in a moment, obviously considering patient confidentiality, are there any stories that you've heard of gammaCore just changing somebody's life? Any stories or anecdotes that have really stuck with you about how it's impacted somebody in a really positive way?
Oh, I'm certainly. I mean, I've spoken with people who, starting with the headache space, I've spoken with people who have been in their house for literally 7 years, not able to leave their house. A veteran that I'm thinking of who got prescribed gammaCore and was able to just go back to life. And he probably had a post-traumatic headache, post-traumatic migraines that occurred after an automobile injury. And this just frankly turned his life back around, and to the point where he's now fully engaged. Those stories are unfortunately not uncommon. They're happening all of the time. And I talk to people in every walks of life who have been using it now for 5, 6, 7 years. In the UK, the therapy was approved back in 2011, I believe. So there are people out there walking around who may have been using it as long as 14 years. And so those were the most impactful stories, but there are just so many from people who have used it off-label in other areas that makes me realize that there's a bigger and more impactful strategy than just put people on more drugs. Albert Einstein was a famous physicist, but he became, I guess, somewhat of someone who talked about what's the future and futuristic thoughts. And he said back in 1934 that the future of medicine is the future of frequencies, and that the physician of the future will be a master of both the chemical side, drugs, and the physical side, electricity. And it's really interesting to me that his predictions are really coming true today. When we think about some of the most effective therapies that we have in medicine for back pain, for example, it's a spinal cord stimulator. They are extraordinarily effective. If you think about the best strategies we have for epilepsy, it's an implanted vagus nerve stimulator. If you think about the best strategies we have for sacral or urinary incontinence, people will try drugs, but they pretty frequently fail. We put in a stimulator to control the frequency and the urination. And I think we're going to get to a point where non-invasive vagus nerve stimulator is not only going to be effective in a lot of different areas, we're going to have to do the homework to show all that, but having a therapy that's non-invasive like ours is going to open this up to the masses. You know, there are 8 billion people in the world that can't afford drugs, and having strategies like this that could potentially just be part of your cell phone, an app on your phone that does this, is going to really, I think, hopefully change medicine.
For folks with cluster headaches or migraine, are there any other interventions that you recommend people try first before they explore the gammaCore device?
Well, certainly. I mean, there are triggers that we have in both worlds, right? Migraines in particular. Some people are very sensitive to chocolates or red wine or certain types of cheeses. One should be thinking about avoiding those strategies. Or those things. Sleep disturbances. A lot of people with both migraine and cluster note that when they are sleep deprived, they're more likely to get into attacks, and to take some general self-hygiene. And I mean by that sleep hygiene. Make sure you're sleeping enough. Stress is another one, and it's easier said than done, but don't let them get to you. You know, there's only person that can cause stress is you. You need to figure out how to not accept that stress and build up in you. So there are some general strategies. There are medications that can work for some people. Some have the anti-inflammatory medications, and some of the triptans in particular for migraines can work for people. But beyond that, this is such a safe therapy that I think that we should be integrating this very early on in our treatment strategies. There are so many positive effects that we've noted. So for on-label use of cluster and migraine, we've noted that there's an improvement in GI function, there's improvement in your mood, there's an improvement in your sleep. So the downstream effects are all actually pretty good. So in terms of comparing this to drugs, for example, in my mind, it should be thought of pretty early on, but by your physician, of course. And then, of course, if things don't work out, and they don't always work out, there are strategies of nerve blocks and implants that we can put in different parts of the nervous system that work extraordinarily well. So part of the message should be maintain the faith and keep the hope, because there are a lot of strategies. And if what we're doing right now isn't working, let's come back to the foundations of, as you mentioned earlier, are we dealing with our diet? Are we dealing with our stress, our inflammation? Are we doing all of that right? And reassess that. And if this doesn't work, it doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a good percentage. There are other strategies that the interventional pain physicians offer that involve nerve blocks on the sphenopalatine ganglion or implanting electrodes on the occipital nerve. There are strategies that are very effective, but they carry a level of risk that I would rather avoid for myself and for my patients if I can.
Dr. Staats, is there anything that I haven't asked you about that you find to be a common question or you think listeners would benefit from hearing?
I would just say, concentrating on the cluster and migraine, you have to use it for it to be effective. And in the studies that we've done that have had not the best results, we found that some of the patients just kept it on their bedside and didn't turn it on. It won't work if you don't use it. So you have to be engaged in your own healthcare for the therapy to work.
Absolutely. That's a big thing. Big thing that I talk about on this show is being an advocate for yourself. It's what I've done, and it's what listeners are doing just by listening to this podcast.
Thank you for your service to all our patients out there. I appreciate that.
Dr. Staats, thank you so much for your time. This has been very interesting. I've learned a lot from it, and I hope our listeners have too.
Thanks, Adam.
As you've probably gathered, gammaCore wasn't the magical unicorn for me. But that doesn't discourage me, because what I've learned about myself is that I probably don't have a magical unicorn. I have many very small unicorns who don't even have enough magic to sprout horns yet. I know, weird analogy, sorry about that. But I do know that gammaCore has been very effective for other headache and migraine sufferers like us. So, if this is something you'd like to explore and have a conversation with your PCP, neurologist, or headache specialist about, you can get more information at gammaCore.com, and I've included a link in the episode notes. I'd also encourage you to think of someone you know who has cluster headaches or migraine and text this episode to them right now. Just imagine if this episode of this one random podcast could be the thing that literally changes their life for the better. In the next episode, we'll explore Botox injections as a treatment for chronic headaches and migraine. Please consider subscribing to This Headache Journey wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave a review on Apple if you found this episode helpful. Thanks to Dr. Staats for the informative chat, and thanks to gammaCore for sponsoring this season. And thank you for joining me on this headache journey.